Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of our Science on Film series. My name is Keith Benny. I'm the coordinator of adult learning here at TIFF Bell Lightbox. We're delighted that you're here for tonight's special guest, Distinguished Professor Elizabeth Loftus, on Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. TIFF would like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Thank you as well to our Science on Film partner, Penguin Books. And we'd also like to recognize and thank some of our community members who have generously helped spread the word about Science on Film. These include the Royal Canadian Institute for the Advancement of Science, Science Rendezvous, and CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. There are 3 more exciting films and conversations to look forward to as part of our Wednesday night series. Science fiction author Robert J. Sawyer on The Day the Earth Stood Still on April 25th. Sexuality researcher Dr. Robin Milhausen discusses Body Heat on June 6th. And Academy Award-nominated makeup artist Adrienne Moreau details the aging effects at work in Barney's version on June 27th. Single tickets are now on sale for each upcoming Science on Film event. Information on how to purchase tickets is available on our website as well as the box office downstairs. We're extremely proud to have Jay Ingram as the host of our series. Jay has an extensive background in radio, television, and publishing, from Quirks and Quarks to Daily Planet and everything in between. Jay has been lauded and celebrated for what he does the best, bringing science to the mainstream and in interesting and accessible ways. So please join me in welcoming our host for the series, Jay Ingram.
Thank you. Those of you who attended the first 2 or one of the first 2 in this series know that they're really engaging, really interesting, and actually I don't have to do very much work because of the quality of the guests. It's no different tonight. Elizabeth Loftus is a fantastic memory researcher. She has been for some time. As was mentioned, she's a distinguished professor at University of California, Irvine, holds faculty positions in 3 different faculties at that university. So we've just been chatting briefly in the back room, and she's got really interesting things to say about memory in general, but derived from this film. So without further ado, let's watch the movie. So my first piece of advice is, if you're going to have that done, don't do it with Stan and Mary. And don't do it at home. That's probably not a good idea either. So I'm in a bit of a difficult position here because obviously there's many things that I could ask Elizabeth Loftus about that film, but at the same time, I know that she's been doing really interesting studies, conducting studies recently on this possibility of being able to erase certain memories. So I'm going to try and bridge that by just asking you straight out, is it possible to do the kind of thing that was portrayed in that film?
Well, I'd have to say I don't think that's really possible. I mean, it's a great bit of science fiction. Is this working all right?
Yeah, you got to hold it
okay,
low.
thanks. We were talking a little bit earlier about some of the work that I and my collaborators have been doing on memory dampening, and it was inspired by the idea that there are now some clinical trials underway where if you experience some kind of horrific trauma, you can go to the emergency room, supposedly be given, if this all works out, a drug, propranolol, and it will dampen your memory for the trauma. So there is, in principle, and work has been done with mice and some clinical trials with humans, it's in principle possible to take something that can dampen certainly the emotional reaction to the experience and maybe even some of the content. So
now I know that we're going to do a little survey in a sec, but
except we can't practically see our
well, we
people
can get an idea. But it's
Yeah,
interesting because at
yeah.
one point he said there's an emotional core, and once you get that with that crazy 2004 head thing, then you can erase, I mean, I think he said, then you can erase the content. So, there is an emotional core to a memory?
Well, certainly if you, if something horrific happens to you, if you're traumatized, and usually, at least in the work that's being done, we're talking about a one-time kind of trauma, rather than a relationship that went over for a long period of time that you'd maybe like to get rid of. That's going to be even harder.
However traumatic it is.
Well, right. I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to ask. Would you want to do this if it were available? Would you want to?
Why don't you put the question in the way you did in your study?
Okay. Well, shall I? Well, we'll leave Joel and Clementine for a second, because, I'll tell you a little bit about the research. First of all, assuming we are in the process of developing a drug where people who have a single trauma can take this, and what it will do for you is, in principle, minimize the chances that you will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder can be extremely debilitating. Nightmares, intrusive thoughts, startle reactions, anxiety. Nobody wants to have PTSD. So it does seem as if we could take a drug that might minimize the chances of doing that, it might be an interesting prospect. Should we have the freedom to do this if we choose to? So in the studies that I and my collaborators have been doing and are continuing to do, we present people with a scenario. So we'll try it out on this intelligent audience. You're a manager working in a restaurant. You're closing for the evening. You decide to take the money home with you rather than leave it in the restaurant, and you'll deposit it in the bank the next day. And as you're walking home, you get assaulted and brutally beaten, and the money's taken, and you're now at the emergency room, and the doctor says, by the way, we have this drug. If we give it to you now, it will minimize the chances that you will get post-traumatic stress disorder. Would you take the drug? So let's see. We can sort of see with the lights are bright up here.
Give it a second thought, but then we'd really like to see how many of you would take that drug under those circumstances.
So well first, let's say, so how many would? Just raise your hand. Or say, yeah, give it to me. Assuming, insurance will pay for it.
So that was about...
Well, no, wait, how many say no? Because...
So I think the no's might be in the majority, but it's not, like it might be 60-40.
Yeah, something, man. We don't know how many. How many didn't vote because you're just not sure? We got a few of those.
You don't have that long an emergency to decide,
right.
So, but anyway, if it's 60-40 or something with some abstentions, tell us what you found.
So, well, let me just say that when I think about this, this is just me personally, I would like to die of an overdose of morphine. I mean, I just don't want pain. And so I said, give it to me. One of my chief collaborators in this project said, no, I don't want it. And so when we did this survey, we found that about 80% of people said, no, I don't want it. So I said, well, then they must not understand either how bad PTSD is, or maybe they're thinking to themselves, I need to have my memory be sharp so I can, identify the bad guy and testify in court and get him off the street. Let's change the scenario a little bit so that there is no bad guy. So now you're in Afghanistan, you're fighting a war, and your buddy gets blown up by a landmine right in front of you, and you are traumatized, you're in the emergency room, and you're given this offer. We've got this drug. It'll minimize the chances of post-traumatic stress disorder. Would you take the drug? How many now would take the drug? Raise your hand. How many say no? The no's are still winning.
There's still,
so there's no trial. And so why? How come people don't want this drug? And I presume if you wouldn't take it under that circumstance, then if you're Jim Carrey or Kate Winslet, you're not going to take it to forget a romance that went wrong.
We can actually, when we get to the Q&A time, it'd be very interesting to hear what some of you people who wouldn't take it, or in fact those who would if you could explain why you think that way. But now I want to make this a little more to the movie and a little more general in the sense that, I mean, the way memories were portrayed there were all kinds of little spots in the brain, and you had to take each individual one and erase it. I mean, does that bear any resemblance to what we think memory is?
No. No. I mean, there are certain parts of the brain. Well, first of all, memory doesn't work like a videotape recorder. You don't just record the event and play it back later. The process is much more complex. And really what you're doing is you store bits and pieces of experience. But then when you try to retrieve information, remember things, you are gathering bits and pieces of experience, sometimes from different times and places, and constructing what feels like a memory. And so to some extent, when we think about experiences a second time or a third time, we're changing them because we're thinking about them in the context of a new environment. So there's no one spot in there where you can go and find the time when you had your tooth extracted and didn't like it very much and carve it out. It just doesn't work like that.
But I mean, that may be what the research has shown, but I think most of us still think that our memories are pretty accurate.
Well, sometimes they are. I mean, obviously, memory serves us very well. Without it, we wouldn't, know how to wake up in the morning and know where the toothbrush is and how to make the coffee and how to turn on the car. So things
are okay. Those
are fine.
So you did a lot of work, have done a lot of work, Dr. Loftus, in showing that memories are suggestible and that people can become convinced they're remembering something that didn't actually happen. Can you sketch out some of that for us?
Sure, because all this is kind of new to me. Both the idea of erasing memories in the film and also in the work that we've done on people's attitudes and choices and feelings about whether they should have freedom of memory or would even want it if they had the opportunity. But most of the work that I do is kind of the reverse of this. I'm interested in how people can believe and remember in things that didn't happen. And so I've spent most of my career deliberately changing people's memories, making them believe a car went through a stop sign instead of a yield sign, or that the bad guy running from the scene had curly hair instead of straight hair, or making them believe that they had entire experiences that they didn't really have. And it's pretty extraordinary the extent, the richness of false memories that we can plant in the minds of people.
How do you do it?
The easier thing to do is to take people who have had an experience and change their memory for the details. So make people believe that the car went through a stop sign instead of a yield sign when they really did see an accident. And the way we can do it with a leading question: did another car pass that red Datsun when it was there at the intersection with the stop sign? We can do it by exposing people to a fake witness who utters the erroneous information. These are just a few of the ways that we can get people to change their recollection of something they actually saw. Now, more recently, I and others have been investigating the ability to plant these whole false memories in the minds of people, to try to understand how this happens, out there in the real world. And we'll do it by basically either saying to people, we've talked to your parents and we found out some things that happened to you. Oh, by the way, we found out that when you were about 5 or 6 years old. You were lost in a shopping mall. You were frightened and crying, and you were ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. We get people to try to think about this experience, imagine it if they can't explicitly remember it. And by the time we're done with several suggestive interviews, we've managed to persuade a significant minority of subjects that they had these experiences.
That's kind of unnerving because while most of us in life don't have psychologists giving us interviews to try and change our memories, you'd have to imagine that in our lives there are people with contradictory opinions of things that happened and events that, different contexts that, do you think that our memories are constantly being changed and refurbished and altered throughout our lives?
I think, just to be generous, that people aren't necessarily deliberately doing this to us, but when you have a conversation with somebody about some experience, when you are interviewed by somebody who's got an agenda and maybe communicates that agenda even inadvertently, these are opportunities for us to be exposed to new information that can distort, contaminate, transform a previously stored memory.
Just getting back to the idea of a drug that could, you were careful not to say erase memories, but dampen the memory. Is there any understanding of how in the brain that would actually work?
Well, I can't speak about the physiological aspects of it. And we don't even know whether it just dampens the emotional content, the emotional reaction to the experience, or whether it also dampens the content and makes it either less clear, less strong, weaker. We don't know that. It's interesting. One of the reasons that some of our experimental subjects tell us that they don't want to take this memory dampening drug if they were to be confronted with this hypothetical traumatic experience is they worry about the side effects. And Jim Carrey worried about the side effects
brain
here
damage.
too. Was this going to cause brain damage? And the doctor said, well, it is a kind of brain damage. But I'm not going to be able to tell you physiologically how it's working or why it's working.
But is there evidence through these clinical trials that it does work?
There seems to be. I mean, it's all relatively new, but it seems that you can use this drug and it will dampen your memory. And the whole goal of this for human beings is the minimization of the chances of getting post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it's kind of fascinating that the majority, an even larger majority of our subjects say they don't want it. A majority of this audience says they don't want it. So we've sort of turned things around and started to ask, we've got soldiers coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, other wars, a very high probability that they will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Should we force them to take the drug? We make people get vaccinated for their own good and for the good of society. Should we force them to take the drug? There are just so many interesting questions that come up that are associated with this technological prospect.
I had an experience in January where I was a virtual eyewitness to a gangland shooting in a hotel lobby in Vancouver. I didn't see I heard the shots, saw the shooter run by no further away than the front row from me. I was sitting in a lobby lounge. And I couldn't get you out of my mind when they came to get a statement from me. So I said, well, what color was he wearing? Well, I'm not sure about that. How tall was he? I really couldn't say. I was the most useless eyewitness, but you know, I've been contaminated by that idea that you can't trust yourself as an eyewitness.
Well, and you know, we've been doing those experiments for a long time. We and the psychological scientists who know that when you see an event like that, you're going to get a whole lot of different versions of what happened.
I think, you know, I'm sure that many of you have questions about memory, and we could go on, obviously, but I think it might be a good time to start gathering some of those questions from the audience. So it's really important that you, if you have a question, to put up your hand so that one of the people with the microphones can give you the mic, because it's too unclear if you start to ask without a microphone. And we will take you in turn. Yes.
Thank you very much. When I was 16, a friend of mine crashed his motorbike when I was on the back of it, and he had a severe concussion, and he lost about 6 months of his memory, his recent memory, which never came back. It was kind of traumatic for us lot because he'd lost his job and his girlfriend and his house. But he honestly had he went back 6 months. Like, he actually showed up at work. Like, the entire 6 months was erased, never came back. I work in trauma. I've never actually seen that before. I just wondered what was actually going on. Was it wishful thinking that erased it, or was it actually the injury to the head?
Well, what you're describing, as you know, but maybe there are others in the audience don't know, is an example of retrograde amnesia, which is the loss of information from memory, or reduced memory for information that was acquired prior to the insult or injury to the brain. I mean, that's a really severe case of retrograde amnesia. You don't see that very often. Retrograde amnesia, or a reduced ability or inability to remember things that occurred prior to some insult. You can see this, you know, a matter of, say, seconds, sometimes when football players collide on the field and have a little mini contact to the brain. You can even see it with a mentally shocking event where you can get some couple of minutes of difficulty remembering things that happen just prior to that mentally shocking event. But I would say that is a function of the brain damage and nothing to do with wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, Dr. Loftus.
My pleasure.
I work in the field of critical care, intensive care, and sometimes when people are put on life support, they're given medications which are benzodiazepines, which both are sedatives but also amnestic. They cause memory loss. And sometimes what's been reported in the literature is after these people are better, they've formed all these false traumatic memories of things that are sort of associated with their stay in ICU. I was wondering if you could comment on this associated with the propranolol in PTSD study, and maybe if they're related in some way.
Well, from what I know about the propranolol studies, which is only from reading them because I don't actually do the clinical trials, is that you don't see examples of the construction of false memories. But I have heard of instances where imagination or even suggestion can lead people who are under the influence of serious substances in an emergency situation to develop false beliefs and false memories. I mean, there are at least case histories and reports of it in the literature.
Is there any way of, probably not, but is there any way of gauging or assessing whether your memory of a particular event is likely to be accurate? Or do we just have this whole mess of memories, some of which are completely false, some of which completely accurate, and run the whole spectrum in between?
Well, probably many of our memories, I think, are accurate. The problem is that we don't get caught very often with the inaccurate ones. So, if I tell you I had, chicken last night instead of hamburger, you don't know, you don't correct me, I don't even notice my mistake. It's sad to say, but without independent corroboration, there is no real way to know whether you're dealing with a true memory, an authentic memory, or one that is a product of some other process. Because while we use cues, like how much sensory detail is there, how much confidence do they give, how much emotion do they express, how vivid do they say the memory is. We use those as cues that we're hearing a genuine memory. But in fact, we know from the research that false memories can be held with a lot of confidence, be described with a lot of detail, be expressed with a lot of emotion. And so that's why we say without independent corroboration, you really can't know for sure.
Question?
Yeah, I have a question. Since we're here at a science fiction movie, and I'm over here.
Oh, good,
Oh,
thanks.
sorry.
It's so right up there,
where?
but thank you.
Some of what you're saying sounds a little bit like science fiction to me. I just wanted to get clear about whether there's actually some place in the world where they're offering people who have just had a trauma, you know, are there experiments? Is there research going on where they're actually saying, giving them that choice? Would you like to have this memory dampened, and giving them this drug? And if so, what are the preliminary results? I mean, is this actually happening, or is what you're talking about science fiction?
No, this is there actually are these criminal these you may think it's that's a Freudian.
Next film will be Freud.
There actually are these studies, clinical trials that have been done, and a couple of papers published in the last few years trying to explore these substances.
So in that case, what percentage of people in that situation actually say, yes, I want the drug, and how many people say no, right at the moment of trauma?
I would have to go back and check. There's one study where they actually used emergency room people, and you know, I'm sorry, I just can't remember the exact figure that because what they did is report on the sort of what happened with the people who took it in terms of some of their reactions.
Because the hypothetical, like we are talking about here, would be very different, I think, from the reality. If people are actually in a situation, they've just had a trauma, you know, is that something that they would want, given that they're right in the situation?
Right, and you know, I don't think it's any different from roughly 50-50, but I would have to, and it's only a small study. So I would have to go back, and I mean, I don't want to leave you with a bad number here, but there's a microphone maybe coming to you.
Hi. Oh, should I?
Oh, different person. Okay.
Hi.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's hard to.
Yeah, I know.
No
I'm in the
idea.
shadows here. So my question is actually about Dr. Loftus. You were talking about like sort of suggesting memories to people and how they've sort of adopted that as their own. My question was, first of all, is there any way that you could possibly, like in the movie, you could actually change somebody's memory so that instead of Joel remembering Clementine, he remembers someone else in that same situation? That's A. And B, has this idea of implanting memories ever been used on amnesia victims? And, you know, is there any instance where amnesia victims have actually been able to remember more because of that implanting of, like, possible memories that might have been their own?
Well, the second question first, the amnesia victims. I don't know of any study that has attempted to use these techniques with amnesia victims. As for whether you could, I don't know that I could take Joel and make him believe he had a different girlfriend than Clementine. But I know that I can take people and make them believe that they saw things that they didn't see, or they did things with different people than they really did them with. In the research, particularly the research on planting rich false memories, that's been common in the last 10 years or so, in response to observations of people developing memories of having been in satanic rituals and forced into baby breeding and animal sacrifice, in response to people developing memories that they were abducted by aliens. We have people in our society who believe and remember these things that at least many people think are probably not real memories. So where does this come from? What's the process? How do people develop these things? And so experimentally, people have planted memories that not only were you lost in a shopping mall, but you had an accident at a family wedding, you were a victim of a vicious animal attack as a child, you were a victim of a serious indoor accident, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. All of these rich ideas, beliefs, memories planted in the minds of ordinary people in order to study the process. So when I see the people being able to go that far in terms of getting others to develop false beliefs and memories, I think I can go fairly far with someone like Joel. And I wouldn't be doing it with electricity.
Well, and I mean, one of the, I guess, interesting things to follow with the current clinical studies is that in the movie, it didn't really work. Like, people were still attracted to people that they supposedly, or I mean, maybe they had completely forgotten them, but whatever was acting in the first place came back to act again. So I guess to know if these clinical studies are useful, we have to wait like years, right? To see if those memories come back.
Well, that's true. You take the people in the emergency room study who actually did take the drug or chose to be given the drug and to take the drug, it would be interesting to come back to them, 5 years later or whatever, and see how they had changed. For the most part, what happens at the end of a study is, unless you've written it into your study protocol, you may know this already, but unless you've written it into the study protocol, when your study ends, your contact with the subject ends. And so you often don't see them again to get that long-term information.
Question?
Thank you. You were talking about false memories. Is it true, though, that people do have these repressed memories, so that under hypnosis, for example, as we've all seen, they come back? Or is that a real thing?
Well, you're asking about something that is so controversial that it has been referred to as the memory wars. It's been referred to as the, lobotomy of the mental health industry. I mean, this has been a very controversial issue. So I can give you my opinion, which is, of course, people can have experiences, not think about them for a long time, and be reminded of them later on. Some of these experiences can be very unpleasant, and you can not think about them for a long time, be reminded of them, and they come back. You just have to go to a high school reunion. You can experience this for yourself. But
I think I'll opt for the treatment now.
Well, when it comes to this idea that we can take extended brutalization, banish it into the unconscious, wall it off from the rest of mental life by some process which some call repression, go into therapy, reliably recover those memories, and that you need to do this in order to heal yourself, there is no credible scientific support for this idea. We may one day find it, but we don't have it yet. So my position in this controversy is until we have better evidence, we shouldn't be locking people up, depriving them of their assets, and making them suffer based on a flimsy, unsupported theory.
Is there some risk in the course of a therapy like that that the therapist maybe unwittingly would do the very thing that you found in your studies, that not uncovering a memory but creating it?
Well, this is what we've worried about when she goes into therapy and she's got an eating disorder, maybe she's depressed, and the therapist says, everyone I've seen with those symptoms was sexually abused as a child. I wonder if anything like that happened to you. Oh, you don't remember anything like that? Well, why don't you just close your eyes and try to imagine who might have done this to you and where might it have happened and how old might you have been? And that this very process, in this example, guided imagination, but add a little sexualized dream interpretation and other techniques that you might be unwittingly creating false memories in the minds of people rather than retrieving true ones.
Dr. Loftus, earlier you sort of mentioned that soldiers from Iraq or I guess any soldiers in wars would be forced to, there may be a possibility that they would be forced to undergo or to take this drug to dampen memories. And I was just wondering, what would justify that, given that so many people here and in some of the studies that you mentioned say they would not want that done?
Well, well, first of all, let me back up a little and say that when the work started to be publicized on propranolol and its memory dampening qualities, it did lead to a whole lot of interesting discussion. Should people have the freedom of memory, as law professor Adam Kolber referred to it? Should they have the freedom to dampen their memory if they want, or do they bear some responsibility to society to keep their memory fresh so that if they need to testify in court, they can be a persuasive and effective witness and put away the bad guys and reduce the chances that this bad person will do this again to someone else? So that's where the debate lay for a long time. Then when we started to do our studies and found that lots of people claimed they didn't want it, then people started to ask this new question. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the new question, is there some chance that even if people don't want something, we might, as a society, decide that they should get it, just like we do with vaccinations. Not everybody wants to have vaccinations or have their kids vaccinated, but we believe as a society that it's better for the individual and better for the society if people are required to do it. And so could somebody make a decision about this sort of thing? When these soldiers come back and they develop post-traumatic stress disorder, it's extremely debilitating for them and their families and everybody around them, and very expensive as a medical cost for society. So, I mean, so an argument could be made that maybe there should be at least strong urging if this thing turns out to be as effective as its promise.
And anybody that who would care to explain why they wouldn't have this done as part of a question, I'd like to hear that, but we're here now.
Oh, that was actually...
Yeah. Tell us.
So, well, I chose that I wouldn't get it done because I was wondering if it would be possible to get rid of the emotional response without dampening the memory itself. I'm a psych undergrad at U of T, and I had to do a critique last semester on reconsolidation theory. There was a paper written, and I thought, oh, it's fantastic, that's great, they can still have the memory and the learning and stuff without the emotional response, but there was a lot of criticism about that paper, so I was wondering what your view on that was.
Well, you know, even the idea of reconsolidation is itself somewhat controversial.
What is that?
Well, this is kind of, maybe, would you like to try to explain it? Because you're
No, not at all.
the undergraduate at UT. I mean, well, it's the idea that the first time you encounter something, presumably you store some bits and pieces of memory about it. But the second time, if I later on ask you to think about that memory again, you bring it up into an active state, and you might think about it slightly differently and then according to reconsolidation theory, you consolidate it again, but it's kind of a modified version of its former self. And I suppose that the idea here is there are people who think that you don't have to just have the drug, the propranolol, the memory dampening drug, within hours of your trauma in the emergency room, that you might, in principle, be able to have the memory be revived, have the drug at that time. So that could be days later or whenever, and you would store then a less potent memory, at least emotionally. Since these things are so new, we still need to kind of figure out the doses, figure out, is it dampening the emotion? Is it dampening the content? Is it a little of both? At what doses? At what time periods? And there's just so much to learn.
The most vivid memories are quite often emotional ones, aren't they? So, I mean, emotion is a key content of memory in general.
Well, it is, but emotion is also sometimes what convinces us we're dealing with a real memory, whether we are or not.
Like flashbulb memories where people supposedly remember all kinds of detail of where they were when such and such happened. But I guess it's been shown that those aren't as accurate as the people who have them think they are.
Yes. So what Jay is referring to when he talks about flashbulb memories is, let's see, we're usually talking about memory for a public event that was extremely traumatic, and at least for U.S. citizens, if you were over the age of 8 at the time of the Kennedy assassination, you almost certainly have some memory for the circumstances where you learned the news. How and when were you told about the assassination of President Kennedy? A more recent example is, for us anyhow, and Canadians would have their own examples, and maybe this too would be a kind of a flashbulb memory for some people here as well. The events of 9/11. Where were you when you heard the news? People have some recollection of where they were, but it turns out scientists have studied these recollections. They've recorded them from people within days of the traumatic event, and then they come back to people 2 or 3 years later, and lots of people change their story about where they were when they first heard the news. So they will, for example, somebody will say, well, my roommate or a dorm mate ran into my room and told me, wake up, turn on the television or something, or wake up, I got to tell you what's happening. And then 3 years later, they have a different story about how they learned.
We have time for maybe a couple more questions. So
over on your right.
There.
I was just wondering if there's any research or thought about researching the drug in terms of where people are going to be going into a traumatic situation, such as workers who are going in to clean up body parts, for example. If you give them the drug before they go in there, would it dampen the memory?
Well, that's an intriguing idea, and I'm sorry I can't answer that question for you because I don't deal with the pharmacology of it all. But I suppose you might have to worry a little bit about whether you're going to be affecting their performance and their judgment and the things they're going to need to do their job effectively. But in principle, there may be something one could develop that would not impair those abilities and just protect the person. Question here?
Yeah, I just was wondering about when you're talking about removing painful memories for soldiers, or particularly soldiers, because I was thinking that really frightened me, because if you take away the horror, you take away all of the reasons to not have war, you're basically removing all fear, sacrifice, any reason we would have to have repulsion. And why wouldn't we just go send everyone constantly, burn yourself, cut yourself, because don't worry, I won't remember tomorrow anyway. It seems like the most ridiculous thing to do.
Well, see, now that really puts a new lens on this whole problem. And so let me just say that in the research that I and my collaborators recently published, and you can go to my website at the University of California, Irvine, and help yourself to any of the articles there, including our first paper on this. We actually asked people 2 questions. Should the person have the choice? And then, would you take the drug? Or should people have the choice? And overwhelmingly, people responded, yeah, give people the choice, but I don't want it. And you come along here and say, I don't even think people should have the choice, because I think taking this drug is going to be bad. And you're very articulate about your reasoning. But that's a different response from the one we're usually seeing.
So I would even say it's the same response as yours, that it's for people's sake that they should not have or remove. So exactly the same reason that it's better for everyone.
Okay.
My question's a little bit different, and I don't know whether you'll be able to answer it. I'm sure you are. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm very interested in traits. And the way we've been talking about memory as if it's some unitary trait, but in fact, it's a highly complicated trait. My question is, we know that memory changes with age. We know that when we're around a bunch of people talking about memory, some people say, oh, they've got a good memory. Some people, they say they have a bad memory. What do we know about the heritable variation in the human population for memory? Is there heritable variation for memory?
Well, I guess I would have to say yes. I don't study this, but I know that there are memory tests that are part of standard tests of intelligence. And standard tests of intelligence have a high heritable component. So that leads me to think that there is a heritable component to memory. You also, part of your question seemed to be about individual differences, and it leads me to want to say that I get asked all the time, and we've done some research on, who is susceptible to having their memories be contaminated by suggestion, either coming from external sources or autosuggestion, which is when you distort your own memory. And, well, I think most of us are susceptible to these kinds of influences. There are some people who are more susceptible than others. And so it is the case that if you're somebody who tends to have lapses in memory and attention, you're somebody who, often can't remember whether you did something or just thought about doing that thing, you are somewhat more susceptible to having your memory be contaminated. If you score higher in standard tests of intelligence, you're somewhat more resistant to these kinds of influences. So there are a lot of individual differences.
Well, thank you sorry, I forgot the microphone. I think, please join me in giving Dr. Loftus a big hand for tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for your questions.
And to the next one is the sci-fi thriller from 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still, with science fiction author Robert Sawyer. And that's on the 25th of this month. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening.